Hello everyone, I'm Rahul and you're watching StudyIQ IAS English. So I'm here with you giving the first reaction on paper 1 of psychology, UPSC Mains 2025. So before I begin, just very quickly let me tell you, we are having the last day of our sales and we have given 1000 extra discount. So any one of you who are left out, they can avail this offer and have additional 1000 discount on all UPSC courses across all the 3 languages, bilingual, Hindi and English. So let's quickly get started with this thing. So all of you who are watching, please mark your attendance so that if you have anything to discuss, if you have anything to ask, we can start with it. So I am starting. So again, I welcome you all, whomsoever has joined me. So this year's paper, if I have to say, I would say first thing, it was on expected lines. That would be my first observation. Second thing, in terms of toughness, I would say it was a usual paper, nothing unusual here and there. Third thing, in the context of having certain elements, we need to see the paper too before we comment in entirety whether the paper was easier or tougher. But for paper 1, I can say it was a very traditional paper. Anyone who would have solved the PYQs would have been able to solve most of the paper. And the second thing, all the questions that were designed, that we are going to have just a look on the question paper, I think these were the traditional questions which year after year keep on coming in psychology. And commenting upon psychology as an optional in journal, so the very first thing is, it is very interesting optional, given that for 2 reasons I always maintain this thing. First, the UPSC journey is something that is not limited to 1 year or 2 years. So what happens when you have optional like psychology, which is interesting, you can keep on repeating it. It is never as if you have you have reached a saturation stage. This helps in a complementary way with your GS papers. How? The first thing is, it helps you in the ethics paper, and the second thing is that given the kind of perspectives about life, about learning, about behavior which it provides, it helps you in general life. And also there are certain topics like learning, memory, decision making. This is something that you can apply in your UPSC examination and life itself. So for these reasons, I find this paper very interesting, and I would say like this psychology can certainly qualify as one of the better optionals for someone who is having a blend of both, who is having something, a technical mind, especially students coming from technical backgrounds, those who are engineers or having studied subjects like mathematics, technical subjects. And on the other hand, if anyone is having a flair of writing, who loves to write, who loves to recreate something, psychology optional fits perfectly for you. We are going to see how this thing is going to matter in this paper. Why I say this thing? Because psychology is a technical subject. Why? You need to know the concepts, and then based upon those concepts, you can always provide your perspective, your understanding. You can quote examples which are relevant from day-to-day life. For example, what happens? For example, you are writing the ethics paper. Now, why people don't score good in that paper? Because you have to quote examples. You have to quote examples from GS2, you have to quote examples from governance, polity to substantiate your answer. Now, with psychology, what happens is that you need to know the concept, you need to know the researchers or the scientists, and then you have to quote a very relevant example from your day-to-day life. And if you're able to do that, believe me, the subjects rewards good and great marks. So let's quickly get started. So I'm just starting. These questions, 5 questions, which are for 10 markers, and you have to answer it into 150 words. So the question was, why did behaviorists avoid the topics of thought and knowledge? Discuss. So see, when behaviorists like Skinner, these people arrived on the stage, what they did earlier, before them, prior to them, what used to happen was that psychology was very subjective. For example, the introspection, all those people who tried to define psychology via introspection. So it was very subjective line. So Watson, Skinner, these people, what they did, they made psychology very scientific, and hence that is why they avoided the topic of thought, knowledge, experience, something like that. They tried to make it very, technical, the behaviorist. So this again would qualify as a very, traditional topic, which regardless of which book you study, I would suggest, like after seeing the paper, I would suggest two books. One is Morgan and the other one, of course, Barron. So these two questions can be, especially this question can be solved in a better way by studying Morgan. Now the next thing, and especially the good thing about Morgan, is that all the headings and subheadings, they become questions, which I'll tell you how. So highlight the major factors that influence psychology well-being of youth in Indian setting. Now here are two things that you have to study: psychological well-being in the Indian setting and the major factors here asking. Though this would be very apt question for paper 2 also, but given that they have given in paper 1, so not an issue. You can quote various things. For example, let's start with the very basic thing. For example, development is a topic in paper 2. No matter what, you can write it over here. So the very first thing, from the developmental stages itself, it's a problem of getting the, right basic hygienes for them to grow and develop. Then you can quote about learning. Then you can quote about the influences of social media, employment, and given that it has asked about psychological well-being, you can write about all the major factors which affect the well-being of the Indian youths. So a good question, but still I'll say this would fit better in paper 2, but nonetheless, there is nothing in this question that cannot be answered. So moving towards the next thing, then we come to the next question. Do attribution process explain success and failure behavior in social context? Answer this in the light of this Wiener model of attribution. Now attribution is again a very direct question. This question you can take it up from the book of Barron, I would say, and attribution, answer this in the light of Wiener model of attribution. So here you can start by explaining what attribution as per the Wiener's theory is, and do attribution process explain success and failure of behavior in social context? It, to a level, it certainly does, because what the theory suggests or what the theory says or how do we see in journal is that people in general attribute success to their own internal, factors, and they blame failures on the external factors, which we often do see in the context setting. However, given that people evolve, they actualize, and hence you can do a counterpoint also in certain settings. It might not be that logical or that applicable to each and everyone, but in general, the theory is applicable, you can say so. So we have one guest over here, very interesting name, Distractive IAS. Distractive IAS, very good afternoon to you. So next thing, let's move towards the next thing. Critically evaluate the facial affect program and display rules in the expression of emotions by citing relevant example. Now this again, I think like the paper setter, he has blurred the boundaries between paper 1 and paper 2. Again, we are coming to this question. This you have to mention of Ekman and his communication theory, and then you have to come and write in this one, like critically facial affect program, display rules of expression in emotion by citing relevant example. So you have to mention that certain facial expressions, they are common across the globe, across the culture, across the societies, but there are certain actions, there are certain, facial expressions, or there are certain behavioral traits which might be finding acceptance in one culture, one society, might not be very much relevant in any other setting. So again, a straightforward question, you have to quote examples, you can write that. Now the next thing is IQ tests are too narrow to focus, evaluate from the perspective of Sternberg and Gardner's theory. So he has asked about IQ test. So a better way to start with IQ test, you can start how and why the IQ test were designed, a very brief discussion. There would be testing your logical aptitude, whatever test even you today in these days, in today that you give, those IQ tests are very much, similar to what these people propose. They test your numerical ability, they test your logical ability, they test your reasoning ability. Now, what would matter more is the Sternberg and Gardner's theory. Now, Sternberg's theory and the Gardner's theory, you have to know that CAP, you can remember, creative, practical and analytical intelligence. Apart from that, apart from what? Logical, numerical, reasoning ability, there are also certain abilities, in terms of like creative, practical and analytical aspect. So this is something Gardner explored. No matter what, for example, I'm a person, I might not be having numerical capacity or numerical, due to my education, it could have happened that I might not have studied mathematics. I, sitting in an IQ test, would not be able to solve certain mathematical problem, but that does not mean that I cannot solve real life problems with my practical knowledge. For example, if this board stops working, I'll find another way. I'll display you the paper on the camera. So that is my practical intelligence. That is always there. And then extrapolating that, Gardner's theory of multiple intelligence, that multi-intelligence cannot be counted on a single factor. For example, someone might not be having ability to reason. He could be very good with certain other kind of, intelligence. So this is what you have to write over here, that the IQ test, which were too narrowed, Sternberg and Gardner's theory, they took a broader perspective, and in fact, they defined that intelligence need not to be restricted to one or two single entity or things. Now, personality is all in our genes. Next question I'm taking, question 2. Evaluate the statement in the context of different personality theory. Now, this is a very nice question. Why I would say so? Because this encompasses a very, vast domain. You can very well start from, given that it is asking personality is in all our genes. So you can start with what? You can start with something like nature versus nurture debate. And then you can also quote the theories which supports this heredity factor, where certain traits, characters are, heredity, and personality as such is a result of your genes, the allelotype that you say manifesting into something. But then you have to provide via different personality theories the distinction that not always it is the gene, it is nurture also which matters, especially in the context of the other behaviorist, the humanist, the psychoanalyst. These theories, you have to put it as a counter to say that personality is all in our genes, is valid to a certain extent, but there are other theories which suggest otherwise. And the best example for this, all those people who would have studied psychology at least once and watching me, they can at least know the studies which were carried out on twins. You can mention those studies to justify your answer. Again, a very basic question, but the interesting part about this question is this question has been framed in such a way that you need to know multiple things to answer this question. Now, next question, when psychologists label their perspective humanist, what these terms mean to you? What is the relevance in the modern era? Now, humanists have been very favorite topic, especially when it comes to psychology subject of UPSC. There have been time and again, if you'll open like in one form or the other form, there have been question on this. Humanists, these people also called as the third force in psychology. So anybody who would have studied that would be able to answer this question better, because humanist, when psychologists like Freud, Skinner, when they started trying to analyze the human behavior and trying to pinpoint like this is the cause, this would be the effect, or these are the certain factors which would be there. The humanist came with different dimensions to it, like Maslow came with self-actualization thing, then Carl Jung and other psychologists, they came up with something like humans, they have this free will. We are not constrained by either by our past, like Freud would profess. We always have this thing to break free, recreate meaning for ourselves. And this is where you can write about existentialism also, existentialist philosophers or the psychologists also, those people who take a different contour from the earlier psychologists. So again, a very basic question. You can answer this. In what way probability sampling appropriate the conduct of psychological research? Illustrate with different techniques in probability sampling. Again, like people generally leave the research method, but I normally would not say so, because there people, what happens, they start going into the mathematics. Now this is a very straightforward question where you have to write about probability sampling, you have to write about its types, the subtypes you can write about, why it is better, and illustrate your answers with different techniques of probability sampling. So what could be the different probability sampling techniques? We have, you just do simple random sampling, cluster sampling, stratified sampling. These things you can write and you can illustrate with a proper example your answer. Now, next thing, discuss the role of biological cognitive learning influences on gender identity and gender typing by focus on relevant theories and research studies. Now, given that this question is of 20 marks, so it is a good question, I would say. So here traditionally, if I were to start, I would discuss the biological role, like we discussed earlier, the cognitive and the learning influences. I would explain these along with the gender identity and gender typing with relevant studies. I would be proposing that. For example, if biological thing I'm discussing, so biological perspective I'll discuss, and then I'll give something like, is there any contrasting views when it comes to gender identity and gender typing? For example, the identity which is formed between a girl and a boy, when you start seeing he and she. So one is the biological perspective, and along with that, the cognitive and the learning influences, when he starts to associate with that identity. And again, given that cognitive and learning influences they have given, so you can go on to add theories such as labeling, stereotyping. These things you can just include in the concluding remark of your answer to make it more holistic, and how things differ that you have to provide with research studies. Now, next question, moving to the next question. Are quasi-experimental designs more advantageous than experimental design? Discussed in the light of various methodological consideration. Again, a question which has been directly picked up from the research method. Again, I'm saying this question consists of 15 marks. People normally leave or they do not study the research method, but again, I would advise you, because these are the basic definitions that you have to write, and the whole answer resolves around one single thing, that is random assignment of participants in these examples. So where you can say, like for example, if I'm carrying out a research experiment on cancer patient, now I cannot do or inject cancerous gene into anyone to ensure that randomized set I'm having. So this is where the quasi-experimental designs are more useful, and various other methods that you can use. So you can write that where random assignments cannot be done, this is where quasi-experimental designs have a benefit. And given that it has asked about advantages, so you can also write about the disadvantages in 1 or 2 lines. That will make your answer more holistic. Bring out the contribution of Binet and Wechsler in the measurement of intelligence. In what ways Wechsler approach and procedures are more effective than Binet approach and procedures? Discuss with examples. Now, this is something that might not be available in resource material. Now, for this question, I'll say that this would be a bit tougher to answer. Not because the question is tough, but because the ready-made material might not be available either in Barron or Morgan. Though anyone who would have read Morgan or Barron, they can write it down, and if not, you can always write about how these methods or the procedures were evolved. Now, moving back to the next thing, the fourth question, describe social cognitive theory and its application to solve large-scale social problems. Now, first of all, you have to understand that what it understands by social cognitive theory, and then you have to understand like how it is talking about solving a large-scale societal problem. So you also have to have one example of what? One example where a large-scale societal problem have been solved. So in this context, you can quote the Bandura, her self-efficacy model, and then reciprocal determinism and observational learning you can write. And large-scale societal problem. What could be the large-scale societal problem? Now, this is where your creativity will come in, and you have to write it. For example, let's take large-scale societal problem. Let's take a very rudimentary example of the society of today, which sometimes ago, let's say, like given that whenever the elections come, the society becomes a bit charged up. So what happens? There happens a social disharmony. Can we solve it via social cognitive theory of Bandura, where observational learning is taking place, where the self efficacy of the person, he is aware that he is able to bring certain change, no matter even if he is a single entity or a collective group of people. And then reciprocal determinism, if you can write, where the person, his environment and behavior, these are affecting each and every one of them. So if you can include it in your behavior, in your answer, your answer would be very holistic. Now, how to counter this or how to write the example? Let's say the social disharmony is a large-scale societal problem where certain kind of discrimination is happening against a particular group. So where what you can do, you can run campaigns for social learning where you are giving the message that social discrimination should not happen, or the right way, a society where different or distinct cultures are there, how they should be behaving. And lastly, a message you can say that even a single person can make a drastic change in his environment. He can influence the environment, and environment in turn will influence based upon his behavior. The other person around him will learn, and the society can change. And not just for these social disharmony case, you can write this with various other cases. For example, let's say like in schools there is this problem of bullying. You can provide proper examples where bullying or ragging is not done. Then you can also have this thing like for the accident victims, people leave them on road. Via social cognitive theory, you can have that bystander effect. You can remove that. People actually, whenever accident is happening, people can come and help. Help whom? They can help the victim. So this is why I say like it's a very interesting topic. And why so? Because you can write about general problems which are going or revolving around here, happening around here. You can quote them in your example, and your answer become mind-blowing. It will give you very good and great marks. Now the next question is, meditation alters consciousness. Discuss this by example, by explaining meditation consciousness along with relevant research examples. So the very first thing, does meditation alters the consciousness? Yes, it does. There you can write about the brain waves which waves are affected, which when a person goes, or when a person is doing meditation, what changes happen. And he has asked about with relevant research examples. Relevant research examples, you have to find it out. And apart from that, anyone who is having a little bit knowledge about the types of meditations which are there, like transcendental meditation, when we have one set of meditation like Vipassana, where Kiran Bedi in Tihar jail is a very good case study. For example, this you can take in delinquency cases also. The criminals. So what Kiran Bedi in his experiment with Tihar jail, what she did, she made those criminals sit under meditation session, Vipassana meditation, and what the system could not reform or the system could not do, the meditation reformed them. And meditation is also taking as something like where this is also used for de-addiction. For example, people who are drinkers, smokers. So this indeed helps there. So even if the research or the research scholar name, let's say if you're missing out, you can quote these examples, these famous examples, which already are there in the popular media. They'll also work as good example for you. Now moving to the next thing, this question is directly from the Morgan. So if you'll study Morgan, Urf hypothesis is there directly in the book, where he's talking about what Eskimos, I think, like Eskimos example is given, and along with how they perceive ice. So what it says, the linguistic relativity it is talking about with empirical evidence, you have to say. So language can actually influence your thought process, what this Urfian hypothesis is about. For example, just like certain people, they are having more. For example, if I say this is all white, so there could be somebody who might be saying this is white, this is not white, let's take this is as gray, or this is something. So for example, in any language, if you have any words that can define different situation better, so what it's saying, the language is going to affect your thought process, affect your how you are going to perceive things. However, in Morgan, they have written only till Whorfian hypothesis. There is counter to this, that it's not actually, it's not always that where the language is being, where the thought is being influenced by language. Why so? Because in different and distinct languages, you can have a great thought. A great thought can come in any language. So there you can quote the counter evidence also, which is the newer or the recent study. So you can write about the Whorfian hypothesis and then write. So these are again directly picked questions from Morgan and Barron. So no issues at all. Do correlation, this correlation topic they have been picking up again and again. Do correlation studies contribute in understanding cause and effect relationship in human behavior? Now, the only thing that you have to understand in this question is that correlation might not always denote causality. What it means, the cause and effect, even if there is an establishment of correlation between two variables, the causality is not always established. There you have to write. For example, take an example. For example, normally it says that the smoking and cancer are related. So this is the cause, this is the effect. But there are also cases where this thing has not manifested into cancer. So such kind of counter arguments or examples you have to provide. For example, a business is there. A business, let's say like, let's take in today's context, again, like how I was saying that how you can quote the relevant, the nearby examples. For example, normally when movies are produced, what thing is there? If your marketing is good, the movie is going to do great. For example, item number is there. A movie is having an item number, and that item number has gone, viral on the social media. Everybody dancing. For example, everybody is using them in their Instagram and everywhere. Now, what happens is that the song itself become viral. So can you judge that the movie is going to do a great business? Certainly not. So this is where you can write the causality might not, the correlation might not establish causality. So this question keeps on repeating in one way or the other. I am seeing this question being one of the constant pillar in psychology, like somewhere or the other they keep on coming again and again to this thing. So now the next thing is explain how psychological and cultural factors affect perception. Do they affect? Yes, they do affect, where you have to quote about the research studies which were done in the, especially in the Africa and among the tribal group. So about the perception of the buildings, or the rectangular building, the circular building, all those case studies you have to write how it alters their perception, like people living in a circular hut, all those things that have been mentioned in the book, how they find the tall buildings or something, the perception is distorted. So is it psychological and cultural factors affect perception? Certainly they do. And then apart from that, you can quote examples. You can quote other examples also, which is given very well in which book? In Morgan. Like Morgan, whole segment about perception would become example for this question. Can amnesia patients recall emotional event? Explain your answer with citing research. Now you have to cite research. So research name you have to remember. Can they remember? They can certainly remember. It could be that they might be having problem in recalling the explicit memory, but the implicit memory or the emotionally formed memory, they often are able to recall. So this would form the base for their question, and there you can write that the emotional memory in the context of this, it even in the cases of amnesia, it sometimes stays. What I was wondering about movies where people undergo memory loss and still the emotional aspect of the movies survive. Anyway, interesting subject, as I was telling you earlier. You can relate with whatever goes around or near you. So now let's move to the next question. Discuss the narrative approach to the personality hinges on answering who am I. Now again, a very basic question. So people, they give meaning to themselves, they form their own identity, their own meaning, they try to preserve their own identity, their own ego, their own confidence. So this is all that you have to write in a question. Is jet lag a genuine phenomena? Now jet lag, first of all, like you have to know what the jet lag term is. Now given that we are in such a culture where almost everybody is traveling here and there, so I don't think like there would be a problem in understanding this term in the light of circadian rhythms. So normally this question would come in the form of sleep. They'll ask about the stages of sleep or rapid eye movement, REM sleep they would normally ask, but here they have twisted a question a bit this time. They have asked it in the form of jet lag that you can answer. Now next, how would you justify the use of factor analysis in the psychological research? Answer with appropriate concepts and examples. So here you can write, given that this question is of 20 marks, you can write like how did we arrive to this method of factor analysis, what things made us take this approach where we are having multiple variables, why did we adopt this factor analysis, and then you have to justify the use. So the big 5 factor in the justification you can write about personality analysis. The big 5 factors still holds one of the most reputed thing in personality analysis, which itself justifies what? Factor analysis in research. As per the limitation of your syllabus, your subject, you can write it here. Now state the structure of language and explain its role in speech perception and comprehension. So here you have to write about starting from phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and again pragmatics. You have to write it over here. They would often ask about pragmatics here, but here they have just presented a simple question where you can write and do it. So this is again a same question, repeated question, they have just twisted it a bit. What enables us to see the world in 3D despite our retinas capturing only 2D images? So what it is? Depth perception. A very simple thing, you have to play around this thing, the depth cues. Again, I think this is again available in both Morgan and Barron. So motivation is a complex process and cannot be explained by single approach. Evaluate the statement with the help of arousal drive expectancy theory by citing relevant examples. So now the best thing what they have done, they have given all the theories that you would have otherwise to write. For example, the arousal, the drive and the expectancy theory, and then you have to write how, when somebody tried to explain it by arousal theory, for example, somebody is hungry, he is going to look for food, but then what was the limitation of this thing? A person who is emotionally hurt, he might not be looking for food even when he'll be angry. A person who has faced a loss, even though he would be angry, he would not be eating the food. So this is where your arousal theory would be, derived. Then the next thing is drive and expectancy theory. Likewise, you have to write what the drive theory is, and then you have to give counter to this. For example, expectancy theory, like you are expecting certain kind of reward for your action, then you do it. Now, where this theory fails, for example, you know that all those people who are breaking certain rules or who are making the crime, they would get caught, but still they go and commit the crime. And this is how you have to quote each and every theory. You have to write about the limitations of those theories, and then you have to ultimately conclude that yes, motivation indeed is a very complex thing and it cannot be explained by one theory or something, and it is dependent upon myriad of factors. Now, distinguish between deductive and inductive reasoning and throw stumbling block on reasoning. Again, in the chapter of thinking and decision making, this thing is again picked from directly. Direct, you have to just explain deductive and inductive reasoning. Throw light on stumbling blocks of reasoning. Again, here you can write about whatever you study. For example, this biases and heuristics, how they, as a thumb rule, they work well for your decision making, for your reasoning. However, heuristics and your biases, they are stumbling block upon reasoning. These you can write via example, and these you can quote it. And you can quote from journal or normal example itself. For example, a person who is having a big, beard and mustache or looking very rough and tough, he need not be a rogue person. So this is, the heuristics would suggest so, given that how popular media have represented them, but the reality would be otherwise. So this is how you can write and say. Reward and punishment sometimes fail to effectively change behavior. Explain with terms of examples. So reward and punishment. So why it fails to change the behavior? Here you can write about the internal and the external motivation factors. So reward and punishment, what are these? These are the external factors. However, people often are driven by intrinsic motivation. They might be working even when there might be no reward or punishment because they are intrinsically motivated. Also, people prefer what? Rand Dicey's theory, control, autonomy and relatedness with what they are doing. So these all things or these all theories you can quote. Why human beings form attitudes and prejudices. Discuss the role of psychological factors in bringing the change in them in the present of Indian social context. In the context of Indian socio-culture. So you have to write why do they learn? Why do they form attitudes and prejudices? So first of all, learning itself. Second, why these are formed. These become a form of what? Ego defense mechanism itself. Second, prejudices. These are itself coming from learning itself. Discuss the role of psychosocial factors. Of course, these are coming from the environment itself. So that is where they are learning. Psychosocial factors. Here again, you can write about learnings via reward and punishment, which we just discussed above. These also come via what? By interaction, when one group is interacting with the other group, and also among the communication which is happening inside a group. They learn it from there, and in the present of Indian social culture context. So you can quote about this, what we discussed just some time ago. You can discuss about caste discrimination, gender discrimination, caste, gender, and then religious discrimination which has happened. You can explain attitude and prejudices from that point. Give two examples of the use of availability heuristics in everyday life. One example when it would be appropriate, and another example when it might not be appropriate. So, okay. So, appropriate example, what? Give two examples for the use of availability heuristics in everyday. One example when it would be appropriate, and when another example where it might not be. For example, if anybody who have seen the Indian movies, normally the accidents happens on the zebra crossing. All the movie scenes, they have accidents happening on the red light or something, somebody is crossing it. So this is very much relevant in the context of heuristics, that wherever red light crossing is there or zebra crossing is there, you should not cross. Why? Because they are more prone to accident given that you are crossing it. Now where it is not appropriate, for example, the scenes, or especially when any plane crashes or something, in news channels, in social media, it is blown out of proportion. So that might cause a fear psychosis in terms of probability that might not be that much accurate or correct. Now describe some major strategies for memory retention and explain with examples, and explain it with examples. So here you can write about chunking, that your 7 plus minus 2 thing. Then you have write about mind palace. You can write about mnemonics. You can write about stories, that smart theory. You can write about each and everything. So dear friend, this was all your psychology paper, and this thing that I have taken it up, this is more or less from the impromptu purpose, in an impromptu manner itself, the discussion itself. And what I found out that the most of the questions which were there, except for one or two, that one on IQ, this one, Binet and Wechsler, direct material would not be available for this question, but apart from this, there was no such question that you might not be able to answer. And hence I say, like, psychology can fit in as a very good and great optional. And the paper, my concluding remark would be, was, traditional itself, like how normally it comes. It was traditional paper. It encompasses all questions on PYQ pattern, whatever and however they were asked. They were similar this year also. No big surprises. And the trend where certain, recent current affairs related things were included in the question paper. So this paper, apart from the jet lag, I don't see any such question where they have taken the present context. In fact, in many questions, the examiner himself has opened up the dimensions, what you have to write. So he has left very little gray area for you to discover or write. So this was all from my side. Do let me know how did you find this optional paper, and all those people who are seeing this thing for the very first time, do let me know how do you find the paper. Do you find it interesting, or do you find psychology as an option? Like, how do you find it? So just let me know in the comment. So when paper 2 will come, we'll also have a brief first impression of that paper also. And till then, I'll see you again. Thank you for watching. Bye bye. Take care. I'll see you again. Again, just a reminder, we are having a special day today. It's last day of the sale. We have given 1000 additional discount on all our UPSC courses. You can avail that, including the psychology optional that is taken up by Saket Jain sir.